Welcome to The Conversation. My name is Brendan Malone, and in this episode, I want to explore the question, would we be worse off without democracy? Let me start this episode by making a really important point, because I don't want this video to be misconstrued, misunderstood, or strawmanned. What I am not saying here is I am not saying that there is no difference between various systems of government that you could actually live under. I'm not saying, for example, that there's no difference between communism or fascism and democracy, that they're all just, variations on a theme. No, there are some huge differences. So I'm not saying that. I'm also not saying that democracy is actually not better than communism or fascism or some sort of tyrannical, brutal dictatorship. I'm not saying that at all. Obviously, democracy is far better than those other systems, and I would much rather live under democracy than I would under communism or fascism or some form of brutal and barbaric dictatorship where atrocities and injustices were happening. So I'm not saying that there's no difference and that democracy is not better. In fact, it's wildly better than those other things. But what I want to question really, and I guess I want to challenge, is the way in which I think that in the modern West, we have now elevated and given democracy a sort of sacred status that I'm not actually sure that it really is deserving of. Yes, democracy is better than those other systems I've mentioned, and I'd much rather live under a democracy than those other systems, but that doesn't mean that there aren't major flaws with democracy, and it doesn't mean that we wouldn't be just as well off living under another form of governance that wasn't communism, that wasn't fascism, but also wasn't democracy. You see, Alexis de Tocqueville, hundreds of years ago, writing about this, looking at America, he already foresaw some of the pitfalls and the problems with democracy. So one of the things he highlighted was that democracy will work for you as a society as long as the institutions outside of government remain strong. So the family has to remain strong. Churches have to remain strong. And basically there has to be a culture of virtue and morality that is taught and that is lived. And also there has to be a sense, I think, in which your politicians have a transcendent reference point. So they have a belief in something sacred outside of themselves, because if they don't have that belief, then ultimately you're left with a situation where you end up, even implicitly, believing that the state is the highest authority in the land and it's not answerable to anybody or anything else, and that's not a good situation to be in. But Alexis de Tocqueville mentioned and talked about the fact that if you don't have that wider culture of virtue and those other institutions, if they don't remain strong, then democracy all of a sudden won't be your friend anymore. It will actually start working against you, and it can very quickly start happening. And I would suggest that we could cite lots of examples in the decades leading up to today where we can see that exact thing happening over and over and over and over again. The other thing that Alexis de Tocqueville highlighted was the fact that once politicians figure out that they can use the public purse as basically a bribery pot on the general public, then effectively your democracy will be undermined as well, because all of a sudden it just becomes like a lolly scramble, and it's whichever candidate or party is promising you the most impressive lollies, that's the one that will probably end up winning the majority of the support, because that's the way that people work when you have sort of mob psychology, group psychology at work, and when you have this whole question of human interests and you're being asked to vote along the lines of what's in your best interests. And even though we'd all like to think and we'd like to imagine that people are very rational when it comes to voting, and that they are not just emoting their way, and that they can put aside things like populism, and they can put aside the superficial, and that they're going to think about other people in their society and they're going to vote for them as well as themselves. In actual fact, that's just not how we work. It would be nice if it worked like that in reality, but in practice, it's not how it works. There's a funny psychology at play whenever you have these kind of group dynamics and you are asking people, particularly when you put pressure on them in the sense of saying, you've got to vote and your vote is important and your vote will determine this particular outcome. There's a lot of sort of a sense of obligation and pressure and there's a lot riding on these outcomes, and so you're put in that situation. Here it comes, voting day, now vote. And we all like to think that people would think and act rationally, and they would think and act humanely, but in actual fact, there's a funny thing that happens to our psychology in that situation, and we're very easily swayed by things that are superficial, that are not rational, that are not even necessarily in our best interests. We can be very easily deluded to vote along and for policies and parties that are not really going to be good for our country in the long term because of what's being offered in the immediacy. There's all sorts of ways in which that can become corrupted. Another thing that is, I think, highly questionable about democracy is there's sort of a myth that lies at the heart of it, and the myth is that your vote counts. And in actual fact, your vote, you as an individual, your individual vote doesn't really count in that way. Certainly the way it's sold to us. Think about the most recent election that you might have voted in, and imagine a situation where everyone else voted but you didn't. Would the lack of your vote have actually changed anything? No, it wouldn't have. Your individual vote doesn't actually wield a lot of power. Your vote only wields power and only counts if you vote in a group. So what you have to do is, in a democracy, you have to get in a two-party system, which is sort of the dominant regime in America. You have to actually get at least 50% plus of the other voters to vote along with you for your vote to count. If you're in the 49%, then your vote doesn't mean a thing. It doesn't go anywhere. It just doesn't. So there's this sort of notion that my individual vote is this sort of sacred, powerful thing that holds some magical power. But in actual fact, you have to actually vote still as a group for your vote to wield any influence when it comes to governance. And even in a country like mine, where we don't have a two-party system, we have a system of mixed member proportionality, so different parties can form coalitions and things like that. You still have to cross a 5% threshold before you can even get a politician into Parliament. And you think, well, 5% doesn't sound like much, but it's actually a lot of votes. And very few parties actually cross that threshold. And rather unsurprisingly, all parties and politicians of various stripes for many years in my country have been rejecting official recommendations that threshold should be lowered. Funny that, how those in power don't really like sharing power. And so you've still got to reach this 5% threshold, which is not an easy thing to do. And even when you cross that 5% threshold, that's still not really enough, because that 5% might get you into Parliament, but to have any sort of impact or to really be effective in governance, you need a voting block of MPs, not just one or two people in Parliament. You need more than that. And not just that, but we had a classic situation. It's not the first time this has happened in my country either, but back in 2017, so our previous election, not the one we had last year, but the one before, and you had this most fascinating and really quite absurd situation where you have our two major parties who get the lion's share of the vote. And the biggest of those parties, the National Party, they secured 45% of the vote. The second biggest party, the Labour Party, they only managed to secure 37% of the vote. So that's quite a margin between the two. It's not tight. There's a reasonable margin between the two. But because we live under an MMP system of mixed member proportional voting, what that means is that if you can't actually get a majority, National were not there, didn't get quite enough votes to have a clear outright majority, you've got to start horse trading and forming coalitions. So you form a coalition government with other minor parties. And what happened in the 2017 election was that one party, in fact, it wasn't even one party, it was the leader of that party, a man by the name of Winston Peters, the leader of the New Zealand First Party. He only secured 7% of the vote. But with that 7%, because that 7% was vital and would determine which of the two major parties would actually end up ruling and which of the leaders would end up becoming Prime Minister, he was the one, ultimately, one man decided the outcome of our 2017 election. We all voted, but it wasn't our voting that actually made the decision about who would be our Prime Minister and who would be the governing party. It was one man. And that one man had a vendetta, had a score to settle against the National Party. And because of perceived wrongs that he believed he'd been mistreated by them. And so he had a vendetta, a score to settle. And unsurprisingly, he swung towards the Labour Party and gave them power. It wasn't us that gave them power. It wasn't us, it was him, the individual. So even in that situation, the idea that our vote was sort of this thing that actually counted in a major way when one man is ultimately making the decision. You see, I think the reality is that the more I think about it, the more I think, well, would I be any worse off if compared to, say, living under a democracy like I am right now, if I was living under a benevolent king or an oligarchy of leaders where there was a constitution and where there was subsidiarity, respect for local authority and local governance, and where those leaders were good, moral, virtuous people with a transcendent reference point outside of themselves that they had a belief in. Would I be worse off under that situation? I don't think I would. I mean, I wouldn't be able to vote. If I had no vote in that situation, I wouldn't be able to cast a vote. But would that make me worse off? I don't think it necessarily would. I could still attain a good, stable equilibrium in society and form community around me, and I could still have human flourishing. None of that stuff would be harmed by the loss of democracy and the ability to cast a vote. So does that mean then that democracy is perhaps overstated a little bit by us in the West? That just because it's better than other worse alternatives, it doesn't mean that ultimately other systems couldn't also produce just as good an outcome for society. In fact, I know some people would argue that unlike in a democracy where you've got lots of politicians and lots of moving parts at play, if you get a bad king or a bad small group of leaders, it's generally a matter of time before that changes, or, it's generally possibly a lot easier to deal with that problem if one person's corrupt as opposed to a whole system having various types of corruption, quote unquote. And I use that word loosely, by the way. I don't mean there's literal corruption everywhere you have democracy, but you know what I mean. I think the way in which it can be corrupted. You see, I think one of the things that we believe about democracy that's not actually true is that we believe that democracy guarantees protection against tyranny. Well, it actually doesn't. What democracy can do is it can actually guarantee your protection against the tyranny of the individual. Although with what happened in our country in 2017, even that is kind of questionable, because we ended up with a situation where an individual made the final call. Not the majority, not the rest of us voters at all. But generally speaking, I think it does provide a reasonable layer of protection against the tyranny of the individual. Although if an individual tyrant does take power and they fool us all and they run a very effective election campaign at the right time and they rely on populism and they just do all the PR tricks in the book and get into power, I don't know if they're going to surrender that power willingly, and if they don't surrender it, does democracy really give you an advantage there? If the guy in power says, well, I'm just not going to listen, or I'm going to change the rules, and he convinces enough other people in power to do the same, then do you actually have a power to protect yourself against that individual in that situation? I don't know if you do. But again, generally speaking, I think democracy does provide a better level of protection against the tyranny of the individual. But what it can't do is it can't protect us against all forms of tyranny, and there's not just that form. And I think that's the one we tend to fixate on. We tend to fixate on some form of tyrannical government. We miss things like the fact that there can be a tyranny of the masses. You can have the majority of voters, for example, if 51% of people tomorrow started voting in favour of slavery, you would have the tyranny of the masses at work there. The majority can still act in a way that is tyrannical. So democracy doesn't guarantee a protection against that at all. In order to protect against that, you need what Alexis de Tocqueville talked about, was that idea of a culture of virtue and goodness and truth that actually governed people's moral actions and the decision-making that they engage in. There's no protection in democracy against the tyranny of stupidity, which is where people don't vote with prudence. They don't vote along good, sensible lines. They just vote in very superficial kind of ways. And that quite often happens in democracy. It's very easy for that to happen. There's no protection against that. There is no protection against the tyrannical nature of bureaucracy. So we often like to imagine, well, we'd be better off, wouldn't we, if we were under a democracy. Imagine living under a king or a queen or a small group of oligarchs and their advisors. Imagine all the shenanigans, the policy shenanigans that they'd get up to in the king's court, and they could be really bad advisors. Yes, that can happen, but that also happens in democracy. We have a type of king's court. It's the bureaucrats and the bureaucratic tyranny that comes upon us. We don't vote for these people often, yet they have a powerful level of influence and control over actual policy that is set on the ground level and how various laws are executed and affect our ordinary everyday lives. So democracy doesn't protect us against that. And I think that's worth contemplating, because I think what we often think of when we think of democracy is we think, great, we've been given this sacred franchise and it's a really powerful and important thing. And we sort of elevate the ability to vote as if it's this amazing gift that's given to us. You hear a lot, your power, your vote counts, your vote matters. And it's imbued with this almost divine-like quality. But in actual fact, when you think about it, it's really a two-edged sword, this sacred franchise that we're given to vote. You see, it's not just a gift that we're given when we're told we have the power to vote. There's also a debt that we inherit as well. You see, we often think about it, we think, wow, the increase in the number or availability of people to vote is just an amazing thing. So, initially it was only a small group who had control, and then landowners got to have control and got to have a vote, and then it becomes all men, they get the vote, and then women get the vote. And now in my country, there's also people advocating and debating for the idea of 16-year-olds having the vote. Now it's 18 at the moment. Should be 16-year-olds, and they should have the vote as well. And we think, it's this expansion of some gift, some power that's being imbued to the people. But in actual fact, it's not just a thing we're being given, the ability to cast a vote. It's also a debt that we inherit. We are now being pulled into the world of politics. What happens is our society, all of us, the more of us that actually have the ability to decide on what form of governance and who should rule us, the more we get pulled into the circle and the sphere of politics, and the more politics starts to dominate and insert itself into our ordinary everyday lives. The reality is that whether you are living under a benevolent king who is just and a moral ruler, or a queen, or a group of oligarchs, or a democracy, there's going to be things you're going to complain, they're making silly decisions. That's going to happen under any form of governance. But what happens now is when we're asked to cast our vote in an election and pick who's going to lead us, then all of a sudden we become consumed, and the world of politics starts inserting itself into our world in a very different kind of way than it would otherwise. And it just becomes all-consuming. And when I think about it, for example, I probably know maybe only a handful of people who are actually qualified enough to understand actual economics and economic theory and economic mechanisms and how all of those things work. I don't even know enough about that to consider myself competent in that arena. I know some basics. But despite that fact that I am not, and that's most of us, I think, we're not really competent in that area, we are expected increasingly now to vote in democratic elections based on economic reasoning and based on economic policies. Which one's going to be better for the country? Which one actually is better? There's things that we can understand as individuals, that we don't necessarily need a degree in or a qualification. I think things like morality and virtue, they're not things you get a degree in at university, but you can understand them when you live that and you're taught that and you live that out in your ordinary everyday life. When you can understand character, when a politician is a moral person and when they are an immoral person, when their character is good and when their character is deficient. But there's lots of other things about democracy that we're expected to vote on too, that we just really have no grasp on. And then we also get pulled into that world. And it's constantly this sort of all-consuming thing. In my country right now, it's budget week. What's your view on the budget? What's your view on economics? And it's like, well, I'm expected to have a view on that now. See, that's the reality. That's the two-edged sword of the democratic franchise, is all of a sudden politics starts inserting itself into our worlds. And I think increasingly more and more, it's becoming more and more divisive, ironically. It's not uniting and helping us to flourish at all. So let me just finish again and wrap this all up by saying, because I don't want to be strawmanned and I don't want people to take this video away and misconstrue it, I am not saying that democracy is equal to other systems of governance, that all systems of governance are equal. They clearly are not. And I'm not saying that democracy is not better than other systems of governance. It clearly is. And I would actually much rather live under a democracy than I would under communism or fascism or some sort of brutal, tyrannical dictatorship. What I'm saying here is that I think we've given an elevated democracy and given it the sacred status that I'm not sure it's actually truly worthy of. And what happens is we fail to understand and see perhaps the flaws, and we often think that democracy is the only system where human and humane society could actually flourish and thrive. And one other thing I should say is, I guess the million-dollar question that some of you are thinking is, well, Brendan, do you have a perfect system of governance in mind then? Do you have a better system? And the answer to that question is I don't yet. I'm still mulling over that part of the question. What I do know is that I find myself increasingly discontent and disenfranchised when I look at democracy in general. And I think part of that is the way we've elevated it as this sort of sacred thing, and I'm not sure it's actually deserving of that. But I'm still mulling over the question of, well, what might an alternative look like? I don't know the answer to that question. And here's the thing, that's one of the beauties of life. And this is when you sort of pull back from democracy and pull back from having politics constantly consume you. It's actually okay to have these kinds of conversations and not necessarily have all of the answers to the big political questions figured out. Let's just have the dialogue and perhaps see where this ends up. Thanks for watching this episode of The Conversation. Don't forget to like, share, and give this video a thumbs up. That all helps the channel. And wherever you're watching, please subscribe. If you're on YouTube, don't forget to hit the little notifications bell as well. That way you'll get updated about every new piece of content that we publish. A huge thank you to everyone who is supporting us at patreon.com/leftfootmedia. For as little as $1 a month, you can help to ensure that this great content keeps happening. So that's patreon.com/leftfootmedia. As little as $1 a month or as much as you'd like to contribute. And a huge thank you, as I said, to everyone who made today's episode possible. You guys are awesome. I'll see you next time on The Conversation.